Alright, so in this clip, I'll open up the high resolution tree that we downloaded and see if there's anything that we need to fix within that component. Okay, so let's open up abdul1.skp. Alright, so when we open it, we'll see this. First thing to do, just like in the low resolution tree, is to go into the styles and assign the working style to our tree. And yeah, it looks fine. So now we will just measure the height of the tree. Once again, 16 meters, which is approximately equivalent to our 52 feet. That's fine too. The model is centered, as you can see, or more or less centered. I guess you could, if you really wanted to, you can draw a few construction lines here so it's exactly centered on origin. Let's do that. You'll find yourself doing this sometimes for models. It's very common that models that you download from the warehouse aren't centered on the model origin. Just gonna center this tree right here. Okay. All right. So just by clicking on it, I can tell that there's a lot of stuff inside. I want to make sure that it's organized properly, so I'm going to go into the Outliner tab. All right. So the first thing we see that when we open the Outliner is that this tree is in fact a group. Now, when you see that there's a group inside a component that you downloaded from the Google warehouse, there must be a warning sign flashing inside of your head because it's dangerous in SketchUp to mix groups and components. And to understand why, I'm going to explain the main differences between the two. Some of what you might already be familiar with, but because we're going to be using so much components in this a series of courses, I find it important to reiterate on that. So I'm going to create two boxes here, and this one I'm going to color it in, let's say, pink, and I'm going to transform this into a group and copy it over and copy it over 2 times over here and 2. And for this one, I'm going to color it in, let's say, yellow and convert it into a component and create 2 copies of that as well. All right, there we go. So the first difference between a group and a component, and the one that people are the most familiar with most of the time, is that if I make a change to one of the groups here, it doesn't reflect in the other groups over there. And that's the main reason that people use groups instead of components. You can actually achieve the same effect in a component by making it unique and then proceeding to do exactly the same thing inside the component. And in reverse, you can transform a group into a component and then multiply it, and it's going to instance its attributes. But that's only the first difference. So what I want to talk about is differences when it comes to file size. So when we look at this, at our viewport, what we see as human beings is 6 boxes. And in terms of performance, that's exactly what SketchUp sees as well. But in terms of file size, this is not what SketchUp sees. What SketchUp sees in terms of file size is this. So it sees 3 red boxes and 1 yellow box because components are instances. So for SketchUp, it doesn't actually need to store the information of this component 3 times. It just needs to store a script that basically tells it that it's multiplied 2 times to the right hand side of itself. So for that reason, if you have a lot of repeated elements, it's a lot more efficient to use components than to use groups. And because of that, because what we're working on here is a tree that's meant to be repeated, then we for sure want to have it as a component and not a group, because this is a heavy object. So we don't want SketchUp to be calculating this, several times over for no reason. The other difference between groups and components that's going to be relevant to us is that a component actually has an internal set of axes. So if you right click on this component and you click on change axes, it's going to show you the axis system that this component is using. This means that if this, for example, wasn't a box but was a more complex object and I wanted my axes to be different, I could realign them. And that's also going to be important for objects like roofs later on that we're going to be working on, which are most of the time at an angle. So this is another useful feature of components. And the last useful feature of components that we're going to be using a lot is the fact that you can swap a component with another object that's going to come in and place itself on the same origin system as the component itself. So that's what essentially we're using to replace the trees in the model. And this is why my rule of thumb is that I always work with components. In my opinion, anything that a group can do, a component can do better. So because components are much more flexible than groups in general, and because we're going to be using a lot of component-specific features in this course, we'll just always stick to using components. And we're going to go into our tree, going to go back to our outliner. And what I'm going to do, of course, is to make this a component. Now, if we look at what's inside this big tree component, we see that we have a lot of, other smaller components, which include the leaf components. So that's actually a perfectly fine way of organizing it, since those are repeated elements. It absolutely makes sense that they are organized into components. So that's perfectly fine. We'll leave it as is. Just to check, there are no other groups in here. No, there aren't. So yeah, that's exactly what we want. Good. That's about it for this tree. The only other thing we might want to do is we want to save it with a more reasonable name. So I'm just going to go to File, Save As, and save it as a tree birch. And instead of L, I'm going to type H for high res, and then hit save. Alright, so that was it for this clip. In the next clip, we will look at how to import and swap components inside of SketchUp.